Well, good morning, everyone, for most of us anyway, for History Valley Debate. I'm DJ Shonsky. I'm going to be the moderator today for debate between Jacob Berman and Jack Bull versus Dr. Adair and Neil Godfrey. Did Jesus exist? Without further ado, we're just going to jump right in. Dr. Adair and Neil will be taking the negative on the topic. Did Jesus exist? Jacob and Jack Bull will be taking the affirmative. We're going to have a 15-minute introduction. Without further ado, Dr. Adair and Neil, you can take it away with your introduction.
All right. So good morning and welcome to our opening round in our second servo of this debate. So I'll be going through a proposed way of understanding Christian origins without the historical Jesus needing to be there. How does this actually work? This is primarily built on the ideas of Richard Carey and Earl Doherty that have probably done the most to put this work together. Neil and I are at least familiar with this model, and we'll have our things to say about it, but this is a deck that I prepared to try to make a case for it, and why this model, I think, has legs versus a historicity model. So first, just some basic background is that when we are trying to understand the earliest form of Christianity versus how it developed later, is that it grew out of what was already a concept that we can see in earlier Judaism, namely that there is the idea of a heavenly man, sometimes called the Son of Man, someone who basically lives in heaven and will be coming to our world in apocalyptic times. This is the figure that we see in Daniel 7, in 1st Enoch, in 4th Ezra, in the 5th of the Sibylline Oracles. This heavenly man who basically comes about during the last days. And this is a Messiah that is supposed to then bring in the new golden age, and that Messiah doesn't necessarily just win a big victory and it's over. There is also the concept of a dying Messiah as well. So we see explicitly the idea of a dying Messiah in Daniel 9, where it says explicitly the Messiah will be cut off. But we also see this dying heavenly Messiah as well showing up in 4th Ezra, where it explicitly says that he will be killed before the final tribulations for the world. You could even see this concept as a possible outgrowth in Zechariah 12:10. So I have the text quoted here, and the thing to note is that the way that we actually have it in Hebrew, as well as some early Greek translations, is that it talks about this heavenly figure that is pierced, and the person who's speaking in this case is actually God Almighty. So at the very least, some sort of heavenly entity is saying that I'm the one who will be pierced, and everyone will be scared once I come back and have a thing or two to say about that. We have actually some testimony from the Talmud that this verse was even explicitly used in reference to the dying Messiah Ben Joseph. And if the name of son of Joseph for a Messiah sounds familiar, that's because you've been reading your Bible. There's also the idea that I have seen that this Messiah can also have a much more mysterious birthing process. So the text I'm going to be showing here, I'm actually relying on the Syriac version of these texts. One, because Jack will teach me a thing or two, because I know his Syriac is far better than mine. And two, so that way that actually we have all these texts in the same language. For example, the Odes of Solomon, we only have it incomplete in Syriac. 4th Ezra, we don't have in Greek, but we have complete versions in Syriac, and so on. So there's an interesting verb that is being used here to talk about the origins or the birth of this Messiah. The verb there is dina. It's the same that you find in Aramaic, dina, and it seems to also then get translated into Greek as anatelo, anatole. Basically, this is a term that you would often use in a more astronomical context. For example, this is used in the star prophecy of Numbers 24:17, the star that will rise out of Jacob, and so on. The word for arise there in the Syriac translation of this in the Peshitta is dinah. And in 4th Ezra, where it also talks about this Messiah figure, this heavenly Messiah, who is also supposed to be of Davidic stock, the term there we see in the Syriac is also the same word. If you go to Hebrew 7, it's interesting because it says the Messiah will be like Melchizedek, will be of the Melchizedekian priesthood, and like Melchizedek, who has no father and mother, this seems to be also what this Messiah is supposed to be like. And where does this Messiah come from? He says also that this Messiah will arise from the tribe of Judah, basically a way of saying also supposed to be Davidic. And again, the same verb is being used there. Come over then to the Odes of Solomon 41. A couple interesting things. One, it says in Ode 41 that the Messiah is of another race than those that saw him, which is a bit weird because if he was seen by a bunch of humans, is he saying he's not human? That's already a bit odd. And also somewhat similar to what we are seeing in Hebrews 7, saying that he's kind of a different lineage than normal. And also it says that the light of the word will arise, again, using the same Syriac word. There seems to be this idea of the origins of this entity, including this heavenly entity, and using terminology for his birth that is not normal for human gestation. Where do we get the idea, though, that this kind of applied to our friend JC? So in our earliest literature about Jesus as a suffering Messiah, we see things that actually say that he was heaven sent. This is explicit in the Philippians hymn, which is usually considered some of the earliest Christian literature that we have access to, pulled from Paul's letter to the Philippians, or allegedly. I know Jack is going to have a few things to say about that. The Ascension of Isaiah also talks about the Messiah coming from the highest heaven, descending, getting killed, and then reascending. Who kills this Messiah? It actually seems like the idea that this Messiah wasn't actually ever here on earth, but was actually killed in a more supernatural context. This seems to be explicitly said in a few different cases in the Ascension of Isaiah. I have some of the text stated there that says the Messiah will descend to the firmament, basically the upper atmosphere, to be killed, that they will not explicitly go down all the way beyond that point, and that he will become like those in the firmament to be killed by those there. I also see hints of this in Revelation 1:7 and also suggestive in 1 Corinthians. I'll be talking about those verses a little bit later. Then this Messiah, after being killed, is transformed. It becomes an even more spectacular looking supernatural being. Again, this is explicit in the Philippians hymn. It's seen in the Ascension of Isaiah. I also see this in the Starum hymn of Ignatius, from the letter to the Ephesians 19. And this is also in the shorter version, not just the more accepted version by scholars. So this means that in the earliest versions of Christianity, the idea of who Jesus was and what he did was all basically in a heavenly supernatural context. There wasn't a guy running around northern Galilee in the first century in this earliest version of the story. How, though, do we get the actual stories of Jesus? Part of that is that people were creating stories based on revelations they had or what they could extract from Scripture. This is something that we actually see explicitly cited as how they get knowledge about Jesus in the letters of Paul. That Paul says over and over again that everything he knows comes via revelation or scriptural exegesis. In fact, in 2 Corinthians 12, also it seems like Paul, or someone hinted at as being Paul, also takes a trip up to the heavens to basically see the Garden of Eden and things like that. This is apparently how the ancient Christians learned about how the world works and how God interacts with it. Not that a carpenter came by and was giving them some good news. Now, then the idea that we have the gospel stories are ultimately taking these revelations or these scriptural exegeses. I'm actually not sure what the best plural of exegesis is off the top of my head. I need more coffee. But taking those sorts of stories and creating a more novelistic approach to present that story to the masses at large in a process that's often called euhemerization, taking something divine and putting it in a more earthly context. But there's actually some sort of deeper hidden meaning that you basically have to work your way up to learn about. This is something that we understand happened in other cults of the time. Plutarch talks about this with the cult of Isis and Osiris, saying that all the stories of the gods running around in Egypt, getting killed and such, is actually a story of what's happening in the heavens. I'm saying that something similar could be happening in the Christian cult. And then again, revelation becomes history. We can see this, for example, in the Lord's Supper as described in 1 Corinthians 11. This is something that Paul says was a revelation to him, and then this eventually becomes the Last Supper as we see in the gospel accounts. In fact, it might be the case that Mark in particular knows Paul's letters and is using that to tell the story that way. So we can go from mythical Jesus to historical or historicized stories to then people actually believing those stories in mass and that becoming the Jesus model that we know and then try to deal with and finding out what the historical Jesus is behind that. I'm saying what's behind that could actually just be all myth. reasons we might think that is one of our earliest commenters, Justin Martyr, writing in the mid-150s. He tells us that the Old Testament is just full of symbolism and parables, things that are actually there to hide the true meaning, which the demons misunderstood and created all their gods and demigods by accident because they didn't really understand things. But Christians like Justin, who can really understand everything, he will come through and to explain to you what those texts actually mean and how he knows what Jesus did and didn't do. And the interesting thing is, when he actually does that, he shows how the stories about Jesus are being created by scripturalizing prophecies, and he knows things that even the gospel authors don't know, or even straight up contradict them. He will cite these quote-unquote memoirs of the apostles, but note that when he says apostles, that's distinguishing it from disciples. He'll distinguish the two terms, and he'll even call John of Patmos an apostle, and actually cite John of Patmos as a source about what Jesus is going to do. This is not what you do if you treat these as just straightforward historical sources. And it looks like he'll invent his own examples of how he knows what Jesus did. So, for example, Jesus born in a cave. Does he cite a gospel for that? No. What he does is he cites Isaiah 33, and he says to fulfill scripture that Jesus had to be born in a cave. This does not fit any of the gospels that we have canonically, but this is what he declares must be the case. Also, he'll straight up contradict the gospels. So, for example, when he talks about the origins of the Magi, the wise men, our gospel Matthew says they come from the east. This is usually understood as Babylonia or Persia. What does Justin say? He says they come from Arabia. That's not the same thing. He even specifies they come from Damascus. That's not the same thing. That is definitely not to the east of the Holy Land. If anything, Damascus is north. Most of Arabia is south. And also, the two regions aren't even the same. Justin has to really stretch things to say Damascus was at one time controlled by someone from Arabia, therefore it's Arabian. Really strange. But he says this was to fulfill Scripture. So he's literally changing the stories to fulfill Scripture as he needs it to, and also say all sorts of things about the Magi being actually demon-controlled. Again, you read the Gospel of Matthew. Where does it say that? It doesn't. This is how Justin understands the truth of what happened based on his reading of the Old Testament. This is not historical reasoning. This is the sort of thing that people do out of exegesis, not out of doing good historiographic work. Also, there's something a bit weird as well when Justin keeps talking about the birth story of Jesus. He talks about the Star of Bethlehem, and he says, yeah, there was a star at Jesus' birth, but he also explicitly says multiple times that Jesus is a star. How do you square that circle? How can there both be a star at Jesus' birth, but Jesus is also a star? In fact, he'll say it in the same chapter, in the same line of his dialogue with Trypho, saying that Jesus is a star and there was a star at his birth. How is this even possible unless he's actually reading something else into the text and actually sees the text not as something historical, but as basically something to be interpreted, something that is symbolic? In other words, he's also not treating the Gospels as gospel truth. And when we try to figure out what's actually going on behind there, it is a bit interesting. There are other stories where Jesus is actually explicitly a star. This is something that the book of Revelation says in multiple cases, that Jesus is the morning star. 2 Peter says the same thing. The star hymn from Ignatius, again, Jesus is this new shining bright star. The Revelation of the Magi is also this later gospel that has Jesus as both the baby in the crib and the star that the Magi see and guides them. So Jesus can bilocate and change his morphology. Later commenters on Revelation, our earliest one, telling us that Jesus is the morning star is the Star of Bethlehem, which by transitive property, Jesus is the Star of Bethlehem. That's a little bit weird, isn't it? Unless you are treating the Gospels as parabolic or symbolic, this will not make sense. And if they're treating the Gospels this way, that this is not literally true, but there's some other hidden meaning behind that, that might be telling us what might be the real mythical Jesus behind the quote-unquote historical Jesus of the Gospels. How am I on time?
You have 90 seconds.
90 seconds. Okay. So I'm just going to very quickly go through some the stuff that I have been putting together. That some of it is going to be published soon. Some of it is the stuff I recently presented at SBL. But very quickly, one thing I'm going to note is there seems to be a deeper semantic connection between the morning star and the Star of Bethlehem. The text there says that The star was ente anatole. This phrase is actually a little bit weird. This combination of preposition and anatole is extremely rare, and when you go digging for it, as I've tried to do, what it really seems to suggest is a star at its first rising, saying that this is a morning star, the title that Jesus gets. There's literally a morning star at his birth, and Jesus is the morning star. Kind of interesting. Also note that a morning star would be useful because a leading star that is Lucifer, the morning star, is also the same star that led Aeneas to Rome to found this new country at the end of the Trojan War. So I think Matthew knows what this is coming from, and he's using that to play on by having his own leading morning star to bring the wise men from the east to the newborn king. Also, this phrase, his star, when you try looking for things with this genitive construction, that it's also quite rare, and when you find it, you find over and over again. Actually, it's the case that when you say someone is his star or that's that person's star, you are identifying that person or that person's soul with the star. So this is the case with Julius Caesar. This is the case with one of Hadrian's famous lovers who died in the Nile. This is even true of the high priest from the Testament of Levi, a Jewish or Jewish Christian text. It's also the usual understanding of Numbers 24:17. The star is the same as the Messiah. So when we are seeing this phrase, his star, in the gospel account, it's actually still holding on to that legacy that Jesus is the star. And that's clearly not the case of how it is exoterically in the text, but I'm saying that's what it is esoterically. We are going from mythical stories into historical, and that's the process of euhemerization that I'm seeing. I believe I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there.
Yep, that's your time.
Whew.
All right, that was good. Good intro. Now we're going to go to the other side, the affirmative. It will be Jacob and Dr. Jack Bull. Are you presenting, Jacob, or?
Yes, and before I do, I would like Jack to say something, just a little bit about Paul before I present the slides. Jack, can you note some of the caveats in citing Paul? I want to begin with that.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the really interesting things in this debate and how we might move it forward. Because I think that often many of the discussions we have are quite stale now. Sort of we trot out from our side Josephus, Tacitus, you respond with, well, probably not Josephus, or the Morning Star arguments, etc. And then we look at the Ascension of Isaiah, we talk about Paul. And I want to sort of shift that debate in hopefully a prophetic direction, if I dare to use that term, to talk about where I think this scholarship on Paul is going, namely that canonical Paul is a later reworking of an older version of Paul. Notice I didn't say the original version, that is attested by Marcion in his Apostolos. And I think that that's one of the key caveats that we're working with when Jacob is about to present. And as a side note to that, also, again, directly relating to Marcion, I also don't accept any of the dating of the Gospels to be in the first century. Rather, I think that both Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all were creations after the publication of Marcion's New Testament, the first New Testament ever to be published, after 140, maybe even after Justin, actually. So I was actually particularly interested, and maybe we discuss this, Aaron, later on, but when we talk about Justin and his knowledge of Gospels, that's really critical in our understanding of Jesus' history, because Justin, to my mind, knows very little of the canonical Gospels we know, particularly Luke. And so I suppose that's just the helpful caveat to the presuppositions we're working with when we're dealing with the canonical texts of the Gospels and Paul, that Jacob, I think, will be working off as he now presents.
Okay. Jacob, I can start your time whenever you're ready.
Oh, I thought you already started it because it's
No.
team.
Okay, I thought you said before we get started. Okay, I started. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. A little miscommunication there. Yeah, so did Jesus exist? Obviously, I take the position that he did, along with my teammate, Dr. Jack Bull. And best sources. So I think that the original Gospel Thomas, however it looked, I think it was much shorter than the one we have right now. I agree that the one we have right now, I would agree with Professor Mark Goodacre, that the Gospel Thomas that we have right now utilized the Synoptic Gospels and John. But I think that there was probably an earlier version of the text that goes back potentially to the first century. I also think there was an Aramaic Gospel of Matthew, or Gospel of Hebrews, as it's also called. Numerous church fathers cite that such a document exists, and I would recommend the work of Professor James Edwards, who's done a lot of work on the Hebrew Gospel. And obviously, I'm going to be citing Paul, but also Josephus, and I'm going to be talking about Justin Martyr's Acts of Pilate, with the caveat that I don't honestly think that Pilate actually wrote the Acts of Pilate. Of course not. But I think Justin Martyr might be reflecting something about a memory, or maybe a record, or Pilate acknowledging something in the effect of him giving the order to crucify Jesus. Perhaps it's a Roman record that Justin Martyr was referring to. Yeah, I'm also going to be talking about the earlier form of the Clementine literature, such as 1 Clement and the original Travels of Clement. Note that I say the earlier form. I'm not claiming that Clement wrote either of them, because there's problems with that as well. And of course, I'm going to be also mentioning Tacitus, because I also think that Tacitus's reference to Jesus is genuine. I agree with Bart Ehrman's point of view. I think Professor Ehrman is likely correct that Jesus was an apocalyptic figure. As he says here, Schweitzer's view of the historical Jesus happens to be mine as well, at least in rough outline. I agree with Schweitzer and virtually all scholars in the field since his day that Jesus existed, but he was ineluctably Jewish, that there is historical information about him in the Gospels, and that we can therefore know some things about what he said and did. Moreover, I agree with Schweitzer's overarching view that Jesus is best understood as a Jewish prophet who anticipated a cataclysmic break in history in the very near future, when God would destroy the forces of evil to bring in his own kingdom here on earth. And in the Gospel of Thomas, I think we see some evidence of that. But here I'm not focusing on that part. Where this is the part where it talks about James the Just, who had succeeded Jesus to be the leader of the movement. Well, in this text, it says the disciples had asked, who would take your place, basically? And Jesus responded to them saying, no matter where you are to go to James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. And there's a large swath of Christian text, or at least there's several Christian texts that indicate that James was understood to succeed Jesus. And to that end, regarding the apocalyptic aspect of the scenario, and we obviously see in the Gospel of Mark, I'm not going to go through all the examples, but we can see that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is attributed as to have said that the temple will be destroyed. Now, some will say that Jesus did not say this. Mark is putting that in Jesus' mouth. But in Josephus, we see someone called Jesus ben Ananus, who did suggest that the temple will be destroyed several years prior to the temple actually being destroyed. So Josephus is providing evidence that other people, not just Jesus Christ, but others, this other Jesus ben Ananus, also thought the temple was going to be destroyed. And I think what's happening here is that there were people in the first century Jews, who saw signs or an indication that the temple might be razed if a rebellion were to occur. And they might be making comparisons to how, or the circumstances of what eventually led to the destruction of the first temple, the Temple of Solomon. In the Gospel of Thomas, in saying 10, Jesus said, I have cast fire upon the world, and look, I'm guarding it until it blazes. There's also a parallel to the Old Testament, because it does state there that I have reserved the earth for fire. So he's not going to flood the world again, but I have reserved the earth for fire. I think the historical Jesus might have been keying off of that, I suspect. Jerome tells us that in the Gospel of the Hebrews, that James did succeed Jesus. I'll read this briefly. The Gospel according to the Hebrews records after the resurrection, and when the Lord had given the linen cloth to the servant of the priest, he went to James and appeared to him. For James had sworn that he would not eat bread from that hour in which he had drunk the cup of the Lord, until he should see him risen from among them that sleep. And shortly thereafter the Lord said, bring a table and bread. And immediately it is added, he took the bread, blessed it, and brake it, and gave it to James the just, and said to him, my brother, eat thy bread, for the Son of Man is risen from among them that sleep. Now, I'm going to mention here briefly, this is in the pseudo-Clementine recognitions, that the Gospel of Thomas is mentioned. I think the original form of the text is 2nd century. I'm not claiming Clement actually wrote this. Like I mentioned earlier, I admitted there's issues with that. On the bottom there, I also mentioned others who I think mentioned it. Papias, if the logoi or a sayings tradition connected to Thomas is about the Gospel of Thomas, then he would be a citation. I admit that is iffy. You have Hippolytus, you have Origen, and obviously the pseudo-Clementine recognitions attest to the Gospel of Thomas prior to Cyril of Jerusalem. There's also Elaine Pagels. Professor Pagels talks about how John is refuting Thomas. I'm not going to read all of this, but she basically makes an argument in Beyond Belief, and I do recommend the book, that she argues, I think very well, that the Gospel of John knew the Gospel of Thomas, and the way I would reframe it is that I would say the Gospel of John knows an earlier version of Thomas, but not the full version of the text that we have now. And I do also recommend Bart Ehrman's book that I mentioned earlier, Did Jesus Exist? And then we come to the testimonium. It is usually, I would say at least the vast majority of mythicists dismiss Antiquities 18 free, at least to my knowledge. Many scholars believe that this was at least partially added, so I'll read this whole thing. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, and when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. I take the interpretation of Dr. Samuel Zinner that this passage has been largely misinterpreted. Josephus is not saying that he actually believed these things about Jesus. And I think if Dr. Zinner is correct, you wouldn't even need to require a partial reworking of the text to make this Josephine. It is also true that the earliest attestation of the testimonium coming out of the hand of Eusebius is exactly the same as the one as before us now. And all the later testimoniums come later. I'm not going to get into that. That's distracted from the point that I'm trying to make right now. I'll have more to say on that in just a second. The James passage, I think, helps support the authenticity of the testimonium one way or another. I will read the middle part. He talks about, he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. Okay, so this, as those as proponents of the authenticity side of the issue would say, the James passage is referring back to the testimonium, because it wouldn't say who was called Christ unless Josephus had used the Christ prior. He has who was called Christ. He must have used that prior. There must have been a prior reference, or that doesn't make sense. Why would you say Jesus who was called Christ if you had never mentioned it before? So there, I would say the testimonium is obviously that of a reference. Now, I will also say, if the testimonium is not genuine to Josephus, then this would have to go to, I think they rise together or they fall together for that very reason. But I think what's going on here is that the James passage is very much in line with what we see in the testimonium. We see that James was brought before the Sanhedrin and he was killed because Ananus had pressured the Sanhedrin to have James killed. At least that's the implication here. And it turns out it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin, at least that's what Josephus tells us, according to him. Whereupon Albinus complied with what they said and wrote in anger to Ananus and threatened that he would bring him to punishment for what he had done, on which King Agrippa took the high priesthood from him when he had ruled about 3 months and made Jesus the son of Damnius high priest. Now, Jesus son of Damnius is going to be something I focus on very shortly. But my point is that in the testimonium, we see that Josephus is telling us that the historical Jesus had issues with the with other Jews, Torah Orthodox Jews, And he had issues with Romans because in the end, it was the Romans ordered his crucifixion. Pilate had him crucified. So this indicates that Jesus had opponents on both sides of the aisle. And this is where I find Dennis MacDonald's position that Jesus was a Torah reformer to be a very attractive reconstruction of the historical Jesus, which I don't even think contradicts Bar Ehrman's reconstruction about Jesus being an apocalyptic preacher. Robert Van Voorst in Jesus Outside the New Testament says, the overwhelming majority of scholars holds that the words of a brother of Jesus called Christ are authentic, as is the entire passage in which it is found. He is referring to the James passage. That's what he's talking about. And like I said before, if the James passage is genuine, I think one has to think that the testimonium, in some degree, is genuine as well. Whether it's wholly genuine or partially genuine, you would need at least one of those things to be true in order to explain how the James passage is there in the way that it exists. So now I come up to these pseudo-Clementine recognitions. Here we're told a little bit about James, and it is expressed that James is succeeding Jesus. So to him, our James began to show that whatever the thing, whatsoever things the prophets say that they have taken from the law, what they have spoken is in accordance with the law. He also made some statements respecting the books of the king. So I'm not going to read all of this, but the reason why I'm pointing this out is because, again, we're seeing a lot of literature stressing about James succeeding Jesus. That's the whole point that I'm trying to make here. How can James succeed someone that does not exist? So here, I'm not going to focus too much on this. Last time, I focused a little too much on this. I don't want to do that here. You see a curious reference here about Saul attacking James. And, oh, yes, there's another point that slipped my mind there for a second. But here, the main reason I had this slide up is to show that the attack that Saul had done upon James had occurred under the simultaneous rulership of Caiaphas and Gamaliel. The only time they were both in power is between 30 to 36 CE. I will quickly point out that, yes, this does indicate that James was attacked 30 years earlier than the James and Josephus, which I think is curious. Could mean that they were not originally the same person, but that's irrelevant. And I don't care when James died in the 1st century. That doesn't matter. He is called the Lord's brother. That's what we should be focusing on here. I'm just noting the caveat that there's a tradition here that Saul attacked James, which might suggest James died earlier, but that's neither here nor there.
1 minute.
Okay. I'll try to finish quickly. Hegesippus tells us about the stoning of James the Just, and he connects it to the fall of the temple. I'm not going to read all of this. The apocalypses of James. And I think the apocalypses of James might connect to the individual that Josephus is talking about, but here we see that in the first apocalypse of James, it is the Lord who spoke with me. See now with the completion of my redemption, I've given you a sign of these things. James, my brother, for not without reason have I called you my brother, although you are not my brother materially, and I am not ignorant concerning you, so that when I give you a sign, know and hear. So this is a tradition about James not being the brother of Jesus, but it's not, to me, it's not the same James that the New Testament is talking about. Especially when we get to the second part, the second apocalypse, which calls that James the son of Judah.
10 seconds.
Suppose Oregon. Okay, so I'll just say this last thing, and I'll have to finish the rest of the presentation in a response because I have to talk about Paul, and I didn't get a chance to do that. Mm-hmm. So let me just make these quick points, and then I'll stop. Memphis suppose Oregon confused Josephus with Hegesippus, but they can never show an example of Oregon ever clearly mentioning Hegesippus, at least not by name, in his currently attested works. That doesn't mean he never mentioned him. If he did, it's lost. Second point, even if Hegesippus was known to Oregon, it proves nothing, and Oregon could simply have misremembered what Josephus said without Hegesippus having any involvement. Thirdly, the James passage implies the prior existence of the Testimonium Flavianum because it says that the James passage is a brother. It says that James is the brother of Jesus called Christ, as if Josephus had referred to someone called Christ before the mention in the James passage. Lastly, how could Oregon confuse James, the brother of Jesus, Ben Damnius with the biblical Jesus, especially since Jesus Ben Damnius was still alive in the 60s CE, more than 30 years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And his father is named Damnius, which Christians would not have missed as obviously not being Josephus, the stepfather. I mistakenly wrote Josephus. I meant to say Joseph. Very corrected that. The stepfather of Jesus. And that got rid of the presentation. There.
Okay.
Of Jesus himself. It simply makes no sense at all to me. And there's way too many ifs involved. We have to believe Origen confused Josephus with Hegesippus, and then and that later Christians somehow never noticed that, and that James passage was interpolated into the text of Josephus's Antiquities. And regardless of the James passage mentioned by Josephus, regardless of the James mentioned by Josephus is really the same person as James, the physical brother of Jesus, the brother of the Lord or not, it is irrelevant. Regardless of when James died in the 1st century CE, he is the brother of the Lord Jesus. Okay, I'm done.
All right. So now we're going to go into round 1. How many rounds are we going to do today, gentlemen?
I guess we didn't really work that out. I guess I could think about 2 or 3.
I guess.
Well, I should note that in the chat, Jack and Neil were pointing out that we were looking forward to maybe some more informal discussion, especially with 4 of us and 2 people being very prepared with slides and 2 people wondering, why are you doing this to us?
Okay, let's do that then.
How long do you want the informal to be, would you guys say? 20 minutes, maybe?
I think we should go until we've reached some form of natural conclusion, because I think there is so much stuff I'd like to unpack.
I agree.
And so many directions. But I would love to hear first, actually, from, I suppose, Neil, just to give some balance. We've just heard from one of ours, so why don't we chuck it back over to one of you, Neil?
Okay.
Some initial thoughts maybe on those 2 presentations.
Yeah. On that point about the James passage referring to Christ, and why would he say, why would he refer to Christ, if he hadn't already mentioned it before, where supposedly it had been explained earlier. So the 2 passages really hang together. On the other hand, you will come across article, book after article, explaining that, trying to give a reason why Josephus never mentions Christ or Messiahs. And the standard conventional wisdom is that it was just not politic to do it in the Roman Empire. You had to bring up the reminder of Messiahs and Christs. Was only going to be offensive to the Romans, especially coming from a Jew. And you have this refrain in so much of the literature trying to justify why Josephus never refers to Christs. He always refers to false prophets, bandits, but never to Christ. Yet historians, or let's say biblical scholars, so often read Christs into all of those people that Josephus calls bandits or false prophets, but never Christs. Now, why is it that just in that one particular critical verse in the James passage, do they agree that there he did mention Christ? It doesn't make, to me, there's a contradiction there. If he doesn't mention Christ, why would he suddenly mention it when it's necessary to bring in a justification for the passage about Jesus? That's the first point.
Yeah, that's where I think I can meet you halfway, because like I said during the presentation, that I think they're unavoidably linked. So if one is inauthentic, I do think the other one ends up falling down, collapsing. Because, why would Josephus just randomly mention James, a brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, and out of nowhere, and never have explained what he means by Christ? Like who is this person Christ? Who's he talking about? The testimonium, I think, explains that. But if that goes, the other one goes down too.
Yeah, well, why is it then? Why is he
Yeah.
supposedly so studiously avoiding the term Christ, except that one place?
Yeah. I understand your question.
Mm.
I mean, I think it's genuine, and I mean, Origen of Alexandria does mention that Josephus did mention James, and it's something else I wanted to say. I didn't get the chance to bring it up because I was already going over my time. But Origen mentions that Josephus talks about John the Baptist, and nobody complains about that, to my knowledge. I mean, not really. Everybody thinks Origen's got that right. Okay, so why does Origen get that right, but he must be confused about James? So I think that's problematic. If I were a mythicist, I would try to make it work somehow that the interpolation happened before Origen. I wouldn't even try to say that Origen got it confused. I would say, okay, the interpolation must have happened before Origen. That's the way I would argue that if I were a mythicist.
The thing, though, that makes that, I think, a bit hard to maintain, mythicist or not, is that when Origen is trying to cite this James passage, he can't cite where in Josephus it is. When he talks about John the Baptist, he says in the 18th book of the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, he talks about John the Dipper. But when he talks about James the Just being killed, he just says, it said in this book. He can't actually say where it is. And that's the thing that's confusing if the text is easy to find and all of a sudden he can't find it there. That, to me, indicates a later edition, because otherwise, if it were already in his text, he could have said, oh, it's in book 20, rather than it's somewhere.
Jack, do you have any comments you want to?
Well, I mean, in some sense, because of I feel like we're only going to go for another sort of 40 minutes. As it was my intention that, as I stated at the beginning, I feel like often this Josephus and Suetonius and Tacitus or whoever else we might want to reference, I think these arguments have sort of been done to death a little bit. And not to say that they aren't somehow relevant to the story. I think they are. But I do think that without any great new finding of a manuscript without that passage, I don't know what more we're supposed to do. I think the mythicist argument's a good one. I think the historicist's argument is okay. I don't really think that's very helpful. And if I may, I'd like to try and steer us towards more about what Aaron presented on, because I think that there we can really make some progress. When I had this discussion with Carrier, I brought this new material to him while I was still quite fresh to it, and when people were also quite new to it, and he called it fringe at the time, which is not unfair. But every good idea has been fringe once, and that is namely that I think that the question of this dying and rising God, or this rising star, or all of these later great claims that are made about Jesus are precisely that, a late great claim. And I would like to defend for the historicists the minimal facts approach, because I think that's actually far more helpful, and one that is far easily attested in early Christian literature. If you begin on the basis that I do, that Paul and the Gospels, as we currently have them in your neatly bound New Testaments, are 2nd century creations, then we then must dismiss them as, in some sense, credible witnesses to the historical Jesus. It seems to me that many of the apostolic fathers, for example, Ignatius, Polycarp, Clement, Diognetus, Barnabas, whatever, have little to no knowledge of these texts, particularly around Paul. And that raises a really, really difficult question about where have these texts gone. So when people talk about the heavenly crucifixion of Jesus, or the heavenly nature of, or the special nature of this dying and rising God, or the star in the east, I say, well, I'm not really sure where you're picking that up from in the 1st century. I can see it in 2nd century texts, namely the canonical New Testament, but not in 1st century texts. And things like the resurrection are almost entirely absent from the apostolic fathers. The greatest claim of Christianity, that Jesus rose from the dead, is almost a null and void factor to these people. Okay, 1 Clement gives it a reference, Polycarp gives it a reference, but it's only a mere side note to the main crux of the new faith, which is that a bloke called Jesus died, and somehow that's related to your sins. And this crucifixion is very much unlike, you could argue, although I don't think this is true, unlike Paul's a heavenly thing. for the Apostolic Father, it seems to be a very physical thing, that this bloke just exists and he dies. And that's all we're told about him. So we're not making any great special claims or any appeal to a fallacy, that we should treat Jesus in a special manner. According to the Apostolic Fathers, the only thing we're claiming is man called Jesus lives, man called Jesus dies, and in some sense that's relevant to your life. And to me, that seems like a very reasonable claim for an historicist to make. But again, we forego Paul and we forego the Gospels, because that's 2nd century. That's where the myth is being placed upon Jesus. That's where the things are being put upon him. And indeed, it's not just the case that they're being put on him ex nihilo. They're drawing in from other cultures and bringing stuff to that. That's where I think Dennis MacDonald is right. It's also where I think you mentioned the star hymn. Dijkgraber, when working on Ignatius 19, his letter to the Ephesians, he says that this is actually not a Christian idea. This is a Hellenistic hymn that has been applied to Jesus. So after Jesus dies and after this new cult springs up around him, then early Christians are bringing stuff in and drawing in this material to relate to Christianity and to this new dying and rising God figure. And Alan Brent, in his book Ignatius of Antioch and the Second Sophistic, shows how they don't just do it with religious icons, but also with the emperor and the processional cult, the imperial cult of the emperor, etc., etc. And I could go on about that, but it's if I say that I sort of want to just reframe this argument that it's the majority material we have about early Jesus is that man lives, man dies, not sayings, not miracles, not resurrection. And then later on, sandcastles are being built on top of this. I don't want to ramble.
Jack, so I want to ask you this just real quick, because that way the audience will understand the link between the way I'm arguing and the way you're arguing. So, for instance, what you're basically saying is you look at the earliest Christian literature to support the historical Jesus, but you're not necessarily dying on the hill that we know what authentic Paul looks like. You're saying that we can say there was a historical Jesus without knowing for sure what Paul actually wrote.
Yeah, I'm
saying a
saying
fair
that,
way of characterizing that.
I'm saying at this moment in time, I think to claim we know anything of Paul is almost an impossibility. And that's not to say that we'll never be able to do it. I'm saying that currently scholarship has not gone far enough in their inquiry into the Marcionite apostolos to know what Paul believes. Just as an example, we get all the time, these passages about James being the brother of our Lord, and that's one of the ones that historicists like to recite as an example. But that's gone in Marcion, right? So it's not just doing my argument a favor. This works both ways in some sense, that there's an issue there. So I just think that when we talk about Paul, and as Marcus Vincent showed in his book Resurrection and Early Christianity, the direct relationship between Paul and resurrection is absolutely paramount. So when we see a author who doesn't know Paul, there's no resurrection. And then as soon as we know Paul, then resurrection starts to occur. And that only happens really or as a flood in what Marcus calls resurrection mania, which I think he should have called Anastasis party, but that's up to him on how he names his chapters, only in a post-Marcionite world. But then even after in a post-Marcionite world, you mentioned Justin Martyr, I think this is really helpful. I don't think Justin Martyr knows the Gospels really. I mean, it's definitely clear that his knowledge of Luke is very mixed and confused. He may know Matthew and John and the memoir of the apostles, but that's not what Irenaeus is referring to 20 years after him. No way. And he doesn't know any Paul. I mean, how is that possible that he knows no Paul? Now, it may have been because he associated him as a Marcionite apostle and therefore was scared to quote him in case he was accused of it. But on the flip side of that, he clearly views Marcion as a Christian. Okay, he doesn't agree with him, but he always writes pros Marcion, never kata, as would be the future case. Always to, never against. So I think that I completely agree with your assessment, Aaron, about the myths being created and the flood of stuff that's happening around Jesus. But the earliest texts we have, or at least the texts we can show to be earliest, don't have this stuff. And even you mentioned the Three-Day collection, I actually reject the star hymn in that as well for Dijkgraber's reasons. So it seems to me that things are being built on rather than taken away. Again, I don't want to dominate all the time here, and I notice that I've been talking for quite quite a while now. So let me throw it back over just to in the interest of fairness and equality.
Neil, you go ahead.
No, just to chime in on something you said there at the beginning about the lateness of the sources we're referring to. I do an awful lot of reading in modern and medieval history, and it's the difference between the historians and what they regard as reliable evidence and what we see brought out as evidence in the Jesus debate. It's just it's night and day. Luther's reports of Luther's suicide emerged about 20 years after his death, and historians will say 20 years, yeah, forget it. That's way too late. We can't believe them. Another well-known historian in the 1960s wrote about the death of a gingerbread vendor in the 19th century England, in London. And he said this was in memoirs written 30 years after the event. Other historians have said 30 years, forget it. Okay, who knows what would have happened to his memory or where that information came from. You can't rely on sources that are not contemporary. So Josephus, even if everything in the Testimonium Flavianum is true, what he had written, it becomes worthless by the standards that I see in other historians.
Well, if I may, that's not entirely true. I would agree with you that the further we go, the more we should be careful. But I would be careful with that as a methodology in and of itself. I mean, if you look at Apollonius of Tyana, for example, he's a figure that people don't necessarily reject in the same way, and yet we don't have early contemporary commentary on him. Same too, we look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Now, I agree the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells medieval history from its own point of view and has certain biases sometimes. But scholars do not completely disregard the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a source for determining history. And in the case that I'm talking about Jesus, I am not claiming anything particularly special here, just that a man was killed and that people spoke about it. So again, I'm not claiming any, I don't think we need the same sort of special pleading for a man was crucified in the same way that we would for a man was resurrected and walked on water, etc.
I'd like to say something. Can I say something real fast? Because I was going to bring this up in the presentation, but I didn't get anywhere close to it. Judas the Galilean is another fine example. Judas the Galilean died around 6 CE. He led a rebellion. And the Chronicle of Zutnan, which is written hundreds of years after Josephus, actually tells us where he got killed. He was basically at the Mount of Olives when he was rebelling against the Romans. And it actually tells us he died on the year 6 CE and the thereabouts, whereas Acts and Josephus, the book of Acts does also say that, but Josephus fails to tell us exactly that Judas died on 6 CE. But we have no contemporary sources for Judas the Galilean, is my point. And Josephus is writing 60 years after Judas the Galilean had died. So by that standard, did Judas not exist?
No, let me just clarify. If there's a later source and we can see from that source and from independent witness that we can have some trust in what it's reporting much earlier, that's quite a different scenario. For example, Alexander the Great, okay, we've got our records are hundreds of years after he lived, but we know that those sources are referring back to contemporary documents. So where you have independent testimony to verify something, that's fine. But if all you have is simply a distant memory, that's something else that needs to be taken with caution.
Caution, absolutely. I'm wholly with you. Caution, absolutely. But that's not the first. The first statement you made was that we disregard it, and that's completely different. Caution, yes. Disregard, no.
Yeah. If I may build on top of that, it's also worth noting that, so in particular, Jack, your arguments about the dating of the Gospels and the Pauline corpus, just accepting that and that basically our earliest witnesses is more the apostolic father tradition. Well, as the thing I note with Justin Martyr, everything he says he knows about Jesus is because of the way he reads the Old Testament. If this is the way that they are sourcing their history, this cannot be even based on reliable memory. This is people literally making things up in the 2nd century based on their peculiar readings of a Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And I mean, heck, Justin will go out of his way and say his Jewish interlocutor has changed the text to suit his own purposes. So, that's the kind of mess things are in. But also, it's worth noting, one of the things I had later in my deck, if I could just do a quick slide share, because I think it'll help point of comparison I have. Let me just reshare this slide. Booyah. Okay, so the idea that Jesus was originally a dude and then all these stories were attached onto him, I mean, that's a completely plausible hypothesis, but I think it's interesting to do a bit of comparison between someone who honestly is at the gate the same figure as Jesus, but the outcomes are radically different if we compare this to John the Baptist. So with the historical Jesus, where we normally place them, we're basically saying they lived in the same places at the same time. They were both preaching a similar message, an eschatological message, apocalyptic prophet stuff that Jacob was talking about. They were both killed in approximately the same decade, maybe even like within a couple years of each other, again, based on the stories that we have. We even have some indications that both of them have resurrection traditions to some sort, like Gospel of Mark seems to suggest that some people thought Jesus was the risen John the Baptist. Some of the later John the Baptist cult literature at least suggests that he ascended to heaven, or at least his spirit ascended to heaven. So, hey, that's a lot of similarity already with our friend John. But here's the thing that's weird. Never do I find in any of the John the Baptist literature claiming that he's actually from heaven or somehow part of the Godhead or even some sort of angel. He was always considered a dude with, good relations with heaven, but not actually from there himself. So there isn't like the high Christology that you get, for example, in the Philippians hymn. I've never seen that applied to John in any of the literature that literally has a religion devoted to him. Also, it's interesting that if Jesus was a crucified criminal, there's this weird thing that at least the Pauline literature and the other literature that Jacob cites, in Jerusalem, there was a Christian church, basically until the destruction of Jerusalem. If Jesus was a crucified criminal, how is it that his cult was able to survive in the same city he was executed by the Romans or other authorities, and that cult could live there and grow there for decades? Why isn't it the case that, hey, this group here is saying we're worshiping a person that Rome decided needed to be executed in a humiliating way, we're just going to let them congregate just fine? That is actually weird. And by comparison, it seems like John's followers had to flee after his execution. So it's part of the reason to explain why they're in Iraq rather than in Palestine. Also, one other really thing that's weird to me, we have all sorts of traditions in the Talmud and other Jewish Christian sources suggesting Jesus lived a century earlier, in around 100 BCE. I don't find anything like that in like the literature related to John the Baptist. So how is it that these two figures have basically the same starting place? They both start in the same running track. Both even get a religion devoted to them, but one becomes part of the Godhead, and the other one is just a cool prophet, among with these other problems I'm highlighting.
Well, I mean, to go back to the first thing that you mentioned, which was the application of the Old Testament to create your own new religion. Again, that's not really present in the Apostolic Fathers, who seem to have a pretty negative view or a null view of the Old Testament. I mean, I can't say negative because I don't really mention it, right? In the short Ascension of Ignatius, he doesn't even know what a Jew is. He doesn't even mention the word. So again, he's not creating like Justin. So again, we agree on Justin, but Justin, I think for my argument, is a modernist. Right, he's a modernist in this situation, and he is doing that. But again, the older fellas aren't doing that. They don't even have a knowledge of this text. They're not relying on prophecies. They are giving information about how to run the new churches. They're giving information about the false teachers that are around, but we're not really told what false teachers even believe necessarily. But for the most part, they're just telling us Jesus died. Apart from, like I say, in 1 Clement and Polycarp, we get a footnote to a resurrection, which is fine, but I mean, it's not quite the summation of religion. In terms of what you just said, in the sustaining of Christianity in a world where Jesus was killed for the new religion. I mean, I don't necessarily see a contradiction there. I mean, the Mormons managed to exist in Idaho for a while after they were being persecuted and succeeded there for many years. So too in Utah, and now look at them. They own most of it. So I don't think it's impossible for fledgling religions to survive. And I think you're also assuming that...
Oh, this isn't a question of survival. How is it that they are able to stay in the exact same city that their leader was executed for and establish a cult to that leader, and the same authorities that say the leader has to go, but the die-hard and the wool people can stick around? It's also worth noting, in that context of the ancient Roman world, if you had a congregation, you had to have permission from the government to congregate in the first place. So we see that like in the letters from Pliny, that you couldn't even have a firefighting division without government approval, because that could be considered a possible group that could start talking politics. And if they start talking politics, maybe they start talking revolution. No, we can't have that. The Mormons were in a different context. And not to mention, after Joseph Smith was killed, the Mormons did get out of Dodge, or at that time it was Nauvoo.
Yeah, but again, I don't necessarily the case that just because something is persecuted and attacked, things can't exist there. It's also not entirely clear that in the earliest times of Christianity that they weren't just worshipping in the synagogues still, right? Although later on they had a vastly a supersessionist, maybe even anti-Semitic phase. In the early days, they are still run by Jews, look like Jews, smell like Jews, taste like Jews. I mean, we don't get our first non-Jewish bishop, for example, till after 135 in the expulsion. And again, the idea that persecuted people don't exist in the place. I mean, look in Syria, or look in Northern Ireland at Sinn Féin, or look at any of these persecuted groups. They always exist, either underground or in a manner that is subversive and hidden. I don't see a contradiction there at all.
Well, I guess one thing is, it's two things. One, it's the Roman authorities that I'm probably the most worried about. Again, they already decided Jesus had to be put up on a stick. Why is it that his followers don't get that same treatment? We don't even have evidence that there was any Roman interest in pushing down this cult, let alone in the city that it was founded in, again, according to the basic Christian narrative.
But I think they do get some of that treatment, right? I mean, I don't agree with Moss about the complete lack of Christian martyrdoms. I think that it's not actually that big, and it's not as vast as later Christians would make out. But I do think some of them do go to the sword for it. I think that they also go to the sword for it because they are confused with Jews, right? I don't see why you have this need to say there exists this. There cannot exist this separate subset of people who the Romans don't like. Whereas in every world, in every culture, there's always been a subset of a diverse group who was subversive and dismissive or rebellious against government, and they always managed to exist in some way. I just don't see the contradiction of thought there, because we have so many case studies of that.
I'm going to respond to the claim that some people thought Jesus lived 100 years earlier in time. So I'm going to be citing Robert Van Voorst again, Jesus Outside the New Testament. What scholars say about Jesus ben Pandera? He says, our results so far have been negative, but the final proposed code name Ben Pandera, sometimes given as Ben Pandera, is reasonably identified with Jesus in the Talmud. This name occurs in conjunction with Ben Stauda and B Shabbat 104b in its parallel passage in B Sanhedrin 64a. The passage reflects confusion over the identity of Stauda, Mary's husband, or Mary herself. The passage settles on the latter, using a pun from a contemporary rabbinic saying to illustrate the point. She's called Stauda because she has been false to Satavda, her husband. While the passage is clearer about Pandera as Mary's extramarital lover, it offers no description of him. And I'm going to skip a little bit and go down over here. We have independent testimony from Celsus around 180 that Jews were telling stories about Mary's conception of Jesus by a Roman soldier named Panthera. While this name remains somewhat enigmatic, Pandera likely derives as its context. It's in Celsus indicates from a polemical reaction to the Christian proclamation of Jesus' virgin, Greek Parthenos, birth. Such a punning attack on Jesus' origins would be entirely natural for the rabbis, as several passages given above with puns on names illustrate. We'll skip a little bit. It says here, there's a certain mention of Jesus by the pseudonym in the Talmud. Perhaps it is not too much to conjecture that this more certain code name may have provided a model by which other names, such as Ben Stella and Balaam, were later treated as code names and identified with Jesus. But here's what Peter Schaeffer has to say about this in Jesus in the Talmud. I'm not going to read all of this. I agree that much of our Jesus material is relatively late. In fact, I will argue that the most explicit Jesus passages, those passages that deal with him as a person, appear only in the Babylonian Talmud that can be dated at the earliest. So let's bracket that at the earliest. So late 3rd century, early 4th century CE. I propose that mainly the Babylonian stories about Jesus and his family are deliberate and highly sophisticated counter-narratives to the stories about Jesus' life and death in the Gospels narratives that presuppose a detailed knowledge of the New Testament, in particular the Gospel of John, presumably for the Diatessaron and or the Peshitta, the New Testament, or the Peshitta of the New Testament of the Syrian Church. More precisely, I will argue, following indeed some of the older research, that they are polemical counter-narratives that parody the New Testament stories, most notably the story of Jesus' birth and death. They ridicule Jesus' birth from a virgin, as maintained by the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and they contest fervently the claim that Jesus is the Messiah and Son of God. So I think there's massive problems with using the Talmud to make an argument that Jesus lived in another time, especially considering how that ends up happening, like why those references are in the Talmud. Then you have something like the Toldeth Yeshu, which is a very, very late text, that gets history wrong in of itself. It makes Helena, the queen of Adiabene, the wife of Alexander Jannaeus. So Helena is being thrown, I guess, Terminator style, 100 years into the past. She becomes a husband of someone that she never even knew. I don't even think she was born. She wasn't even born yet when Alexander Jannaeus died. It's really hilarious how the Toldeth Yeshu is really screwing up history here, and it conflates Joseph and Pandora into the same person. So now Joseph and Pandora are the same person. They're not two different people anymore. So the Toldeth Yeshu, I think, is a giant mess. And one more thing I will say about that before I stop is I would say that there was a Jesus ben Pandora that died under Alexander Jannaeus. I don't have a problem believing that. But I think he got confused with the New Testament Jesus, especially by the time you get to the Toldeth Yeshu. That certainly occurred by the time that text was composed. And there's a lot of disagreement about which century this text was even composed, and even if there was redactional activity or not. But I think that we have to be very careful using something like this to try to claim that a group of people thought the historical Jesus lived in a different century. That's all I have to say about that.
Okay. And I guess just to go back on this, if you could show my slide sharing screen right now. So I know, the Toldeth Yeshu obviously is a very late source. I'm definitely not trying to claim it has any historical knowledge. I am going to point out, though, that, for example, in the Babylonian Talmud and the Sanhedrin, it even explicitly calls Jesus the Nazarene, if memory serves. So not even confusing with the Pandora title or any other titles, but it's the JC that we're supposed to know from Galilee. And also, it's worth noting, even outside of this, in Epiphanius, he discusses a Jewish Christian sect that also puts the death of Jesus during the time of Alexander Jannaeus. So this is not merely in those later sources, it's also in this source of allegedly Christians believing this as well, according to Epiphanius. He calls them heretics, sure. And I'm not trying to say, well, this is evidence that Jesus somehow lived around 100 BCE. My statement is, hey, this is a really weird thing to even exist if the Jesus story was well known and based on historical memory. So let's assume, for example, this is all completely late stuff, and that's totally reasonable if this stuff was invented no earlier than the 300s. How can the gospel story have been in circulation for centuries and somehow the people write the story and show no awareness of its historical setting? This is before the Roman Empire even existed. How do you have give to Caesar what is Caesar's and set a story before the existence of Emperor Caesar? That's a little bit weird, to put it mildly. So the way that Jesus died, where he died, under what circumstances he died, when he died, the fact that this narrative is so fundamentally different suggests it must have a different origin than the gospel narratives that we've come to know and love. But then it begs the question, how does that actually happen? And I don't see an explanation even with there somehow being another Jesus named Pantera existing, because it doesn't explain all the evidence very well. Instead, it really looks like there's separate people making separate collections of stories about Jesus and putting them in different settings. And I even have a hypothesis about how that comes, because I can calculate out from the Daniel 70 weeks of years prophecy how you can get there. One, we can see how you get the date of 30, because we have a Christian who explicitly does that and goes from temple destruction time, Daniel's prophecy, death in 30 CE, or our modern calendar of 30. I can actually also look and see, hey, if I take the advice of the great Rashi, the great, medieval, very late medieval Jewish rabbi, but arguing that it should start with the destruction of the temple at 586, you apply the weeks of years prophecy, boom, it has the Messiah coming during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus. So I think I can explain all that data on the mythicist view. It seems like there's a lot of ad hoc assumptions that needed to make the same data make sense on a historist view.
Well, how I want to respond real quick, and then maybe Jack will want to say something. To me, Epiphanius can simply be explained by, okay, he knows about the Talmud or earlier versions of the Talmud, and he simply knows about the Jesus and Nazarene stuff, and he may have made the assumption. He may have made the assumption that different groups had believed Jesus lived. I did not claim that you yourself believe Jesus lived in an earlier century. I'm saying what I was trying to say is the caution in the sense of like, how certain does one want to be that different Christian groups actually thought that? I think eventually they did come to believe that. The Tol Def Yeshu is, as super late as it is evidence that later groups did interpret the Jesus in the Talmud to be the biblical Jesus. And they went along with the idea that Jesus lived in an earlier century. And then they went as far as claiming that Queen Helena had lived in an earlier century too. So they started moving other people in an earlier century in accordance. So yes, I do think that there is some merit to the idea that some thought Jesus lived in a different century, but I think that arose much later in time and not quite under the circumstances as thought by others. I think I'm pretty convinced I believe Jody Magnus, if I remember correctly, I think Professor Magnus also doesn't believe that the biblical Jesus is in the Talmud either. She holds a view like that. I'm not convinced the biblical Jesus is truly mentioned in the Talmud. I think what's going on here is that Celsus is aware that Pandera is a common name. Scholars like Professor James Tabor point out that there was a gravestone found in Germany of a Roman soldier named Tiberius Julius Abdus Pandera. And he died there sometime in the 40s of the Common Era of the first century. So yes, Pandera is a name, and it was the name of an actual Roman soldier. So I think there is something to the idea, because of that evidence, that it is reasonable to say that it is possible that Jesus, the son of Pandera, was confused with the biblical Jesus. I don't think we have to say that as early as the 2nd or 3rd centuries that they were already confused about when Jesus lived. That's all I have to say about that. Jack or anybody else want to throw something in there?
Sorry, I sort of had a dissociating moment because someone asked me about Dublin in the comments, and I got really excited about talking about the Chester Beatty Library, which, if you haven't been, houses many old New Testament manuscripts. Not 1st century, obviously, or maybe even 2nd.
Jack, did you want to comment on the idea that different Christian groups thought Jesus lived in another century? Did you want to say something about that?
I mean, again, I think it stands to reason that early Christians believed that. I mean, not to be too skeptical here or sound like I don't trust human beings, but humans make up stuff constantly, and this is probably going to be this favour to some extent. But I mean, newsflash: Christians disagree. Wow, like whoever saw that coming? And I think it's perfectly the case that as time goes on, Christians reinterpret to the point where I think that Muhammad does something similar with Christianity, and Joseph Smith does something Muhammad does. Right? Christians are renowned for creating in their own minds, based sometimes on nothing. Indeed, like Justin Martyr does, even in the 150s, thoughts like that. And so I think it's perfectly possible that some early Christians did believe that. I think that a bit like with Jews, we tend to put Christians in the 1st and 2nd century when we're talking about them into one homogenous, unified group of people. And as we know as scholars, that could not be further from the truth about Jews or indeed about Christians. And so the idea that some Christians believe that Jesus existed in the sky, or that Jesus existed in the 1st century BC, or that Jesus existed in a time to come, I think all of those are probable, just because that's the nature of humans' disagreement and Christianity. We now have 46,000 plus denominations. I mean, yeah, that's what we do.
Well, I think we've come to a point in discussion where maybe we can make our final statements and close. Jack, I know you mentioned. Actually, never mind about that. But yeah, so I think we can go ahead and close. Dr. Adair and Neil, y'all want to say something? Y'all want to close? Y'all want to give a closing statement before Dr. Bull, and I do?
My comment would be that Jesus is very relevant in history, but it's the only Jesus we have who is the one in the Gospels and the letters of Paul. That's the New Testament Jesus, and that's the only Jesus of any relevance, really, to believers as well as history. It's the Jesus in the canon that's the one that's changed the world, really. That's the Jesus we have. That's one we can study. But as far as any other person behind that literature, I don't see how we can have any evidence to verify that.
I think I just want to give a thumbs up to what Neil said, because that's basically my position here, that we are in such a muck, and it's ultimately a matter of what model can we try to put together to make sense of this data. It's extremely opaque on a good day. And I think a mythicist approach at least has value. It cannot be proven by a long shot, no. I just think that it needs to be considered in the same way historical Jesus studies have been trying to reconstruct a historical Jesus for the last 200 years. And, well, that hasn't exactly been a rounding success. And so I'm saying, let's give a mythical Jesus construction and try to uncover the original mythical Jesus as much as possible to advance the field, even if it ultimately doesn't become the dominant paradigm. I think it at least has enough legs that we should give it a run.
Good, and I don't disagree with that. I mean, I often get accused on my channel of being somehow anti-mythicist and throwing slurs at you, which I think couldn't be further from the truth. It's like I've really enjoyed this discussion. I think it's been a really worthwhile hour and a half, and I'm sad to see it end in some ways.
Likewise.
The only caveat I want to make, Neil, and I'm really sorry to hear you say that at the end of the conversation, because I think that's exactly the problem with this debate, is that particularly on the mythicist side, I think nothing should be obvious to the skeptic, and the idea that we have to rely on the New Testament and the canonical Paul, I think it needs to be massively reevaluated. Even if you're a historicist, even if you believe in the historicity of Jesus, I think you have to begin to reevaluate that, because we have no evidence that these Pauline epistles or the Gospels are 1st century, and we have earlier a proof for both Marcion and for the Apostolic Fathers than we do for the New Testament. And therefore, when we talk about the Jesus had the impact, yeah, maybe, but that's not what we're discussing here. We're discussing the Jesus who may or may not have existed. And so therefore I want, again, maybe pointing back to your argument, I want the earliest sources rather than the later ones, the ones that are not Justin Martyrified or perhaps more specifically Irenaeus-ified, because I think he's probably one of the main culprits in this issue. That's what I want mythicists to return to, is that join with us first, work out where the texts come from, when the texts are actually dated. Again, nothing should be obvious to the skeptic, particularly the mythicists. And then maybe, if we can agree on what text we're going to use and that sort of thing, the methodology, we might have a better argument, I think. And not only would the argument be more productive in terms of, all working off the same hymn sheet, but we might also begin to break down the barriers of the gatekeeping that sometimes happens in New Testament study in certain institutions by evangelical Americans and evangelical Europeans. I don't want to cast any aspersion. And evangelical Oceanians. Let's not discriminate in the room. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you so much for engaging with us.
And what I'll say before we close, and this kind of goes back to full circle to the beginning when I made my opening argument after Neil and Aaron made theirs. There's the caveat that we don't know for sure what the historical Paul wrote. And I think it's important to remember that, because something that I've seen so often is that if we don't know what Paul wrote, it's somehow the apocalypse, and that means that everything goes, Jesus didn't exist, and this and that. That's a reaction I have seen from some. I think Paul did write. I think he did write some stuff. I'm not convinced he wrote nothing. I think he did write some stuff, and I agree with Jack that I think there is hope to reconstruct what the genuine Paul had written. But just because we don't know what he wrote at this time does not mean he did not exist. Because I know that there are some mythicists. I'm not saying that's what's going on here, but I'm saying outside of the realm, the scope of this debate, some mythicists that lean in the Dutch radical territory. I think the fact that we have traditions about Paul, we have traditions about Jesus, and that's what I was trying to show in the presentation, that I'm not trying to restrict myself to just Paul, but I am going beyond that and looking at other Christian traditions to show that there is a rich literature about James succeeding Jesus. So we have plenty of texts to work with there. And I think that what's happening in Jerusalem after Jesus was crucified is that, I think the movement struggled to survive. And I don't think they were being persecuted by the Romans 24 hours a day. I don't think one should look at it like that. I think they did struggle. I think persecutions against them went on and off. The same thing would be true later when Roman emperors, they would go back and forth about persecuting Christians. Not every emperor treated Christians the same way. And we know that especially from 2nd century emperors and forward. You look at the reign of Trajan, you look at what Pliny was saying. And then you go forward, you see it's night and day depending on the emperor. Sometimes they'll treat Christians well, and sometimes they don't. So it goes back and forth. And I think we have to look at the 1st century Jesus movement, the Ebionite movement, as I think they were probably called, the same way. They went back and forth with them as well. It wasn't something that was happening all the time. And I think Josephus, like, to me, I'm convinced Josephus mentioned Jesus, and to me, I think it's important that Josephus did mention Jesus, because it would tell me that he was confident that the person existed. But even if it turned out that he did not mention Jesus, I will close by saying, is it really so far-fetched to think that there was a Jesus, somebody named Yeshua, who suffered a crucifixion, and that's it? To Jack's point, we have a Jesus, he was killed. That's it. And then they built all these stories over him after his death. And we've seen that happen with many other people. Crucifixion was a common thing, was a common form of Roman execution, especially against Jewish rebels in the 1st century CE. And that's it. And I close my statement.
Yeah, definitely a great argument on both sides. This is an ongoing point of contention, if you will. And I'm on the fence right now. I'll just say that Dr. Adair has reconvinced me to look back at this stuff and have an open mind, pretty much. From the last presentation he did, but I thought it was really good. I'm just looking at the comments as we're about to close, and I see some very interesting dialogue going on. I don't know if you want to get into any of that, Jacob, at this point.
No.
But
no,
again,
we're getting out of here.
it's a great discussion. Definitely.
Though I think we should all be plugging our different sources, because in particular, DJ, since you were saying that you're rekindled with this, I want to say that Neil has been blogging this sorts of material for many, many years, has a huge backlog of stuff that has been, I think, very good and even-handed in many of these cases. So I think you can find a lot of sources and discussion on his site as well. And of course, I'm going to plug myself as much as possible as my own publications trickle out.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'll have the links to Neil's blog and to Dr. Adair's books, website, all in the description below, and to Dr. Jack Bull's Patristica YouTube channel. And with that being said, I thank all of you for joining me today. This was a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.